Okay, so Joshua 22. I'm going to set us up a little bit, all right? So we're nearing the end of Joshua. We're nearing the end of our sermon series. And as we've read through the book of Joshua, we've seen a lot of stuff. Now, I want you to imagine with me right now, so there's 12 tribes, right? And if you remember early on in the book of Joshua, 2.5 of the tribes had already settled land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. It was already promised to them by Moses before he died. And so they had already settled the women and children on the eastern side of the Jordan. But the western side of the Jordan was still yet to be conquered and taken over. And those 2.5 tribes on the eastern side, they agreed, they promised. They said, even though we've already got our land, we're going to fight with the rest of you guys to get the western side of the Jordan as well. That's our promise to you. We will do that. And so they fought with them. Can you imagine in battle, right? You know, we've heard about it. We've seen movies about band of brothers, right? When you fight together, there's a bond, right? I mean, you've spilled blood together. You love each other. You will fight for each other. And that's what they did. And now all the fighting is over. Joshua's, portioned out the territories to the rest of the tribes. And now Joshua's saying, you eastern tribes, you 2.5 eastern tribes, you can go back to your families. Go back. God bless you. It's been great. Take all the spoils that you've collected and go back and God bless you. And so that's where we're at in Joshua 22, all right? And so we're going to pick it up now in verse 10. So if you're there, Joshua 22, verse 10, and they're heading back, right? And for those of you scholars out there that want to make sure who the tribes are, it's the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. All right, verse 10. So they're heading back now to the eastern side. So they're going to cross over the Jordan back to the eastern side. When they came to Geliloth, near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. And when the Israelites, that's the rest of the tribes, right, on the western side, when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Geliloth near the Jordan on the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. All right, let's pause for a moment. I mean, just even in a short couple sentences, you're like, whoa. This went from 1 to 10 in a hurry. So that here we were, they're hugging each other, kissing each other. Thanks for fighting alongside us. And then the 2.5 eastern tribes, they're like, before they cross over the Jordan back to their families, they say, you know what, we're going to build an imposing altar. It says an imposing altar in the Bible right there. I can't imagine what that must have looked like. But it was big enough that word got back to the other tribes. And what do we read right there? They're like, it's time to go to war. Our own brothers who fought with us, who spilled blood with us. Now we got to go to war against them. So I want us to feel that for a moment. Like, we're only given the span of a couple verses here, but they're ready to go to war with each other. Brothers. Like, whoa, what's going on? All right, now let's pick it up in verse 16 as we read a little bit further. And so the rest of the Israelites, right, they're ready to go to war. And some of you are probably thinking, man, what is going on? Hey, we'll unpack it, don't worry. But now in verse 16, Phinehas, the high priest, along with a delegation from the western tribes, the Israelites, they come and meet with the eastern tribes, basically to say, hey guys, what's going on? What are you doing? Right? So verse 16, it says this. The whole assembly of the Lord says, this is them talking to the eastern tribes. How could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? And then let's skip down to verse 18. And are you now turning away from the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, other than the altar of the Lord our God. Now let's pause right there for a moment. So Phinehas, the high priest, along with representatives of the western tribes, they come and they say, guys, what are you doing? Don't do this. You're dishonoring the Lord. And they even, don't you remember what happens when one of us sins? It affects all of us, right? We heard that in a sermon before, that sin is infectious and it can infect others around us. And they're saying, don't do this, guys. And they even say, look, please don't do it. In fact, why don't you guys just come back over on the western side of the Jordan? We'll give you some of our land. Just don't do this. You follow it so far? You feel it? Okay, now let's go to 22, verse 22. And this is their response to them. Actually, wait, yeah, 22. So now these are the eastern tribes speaking to the western tribes in response. The mighty one, God the Lord. The mighty one, God the Lord. He knows. And let Israel know, if this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord. So your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. And then let's skip down a couple verses. Verse 29, the eastern tribes are still speaking. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord and turn away from him today by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifices, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. All right. So, it's all a big misunderstanding. Right? So when we first read that text, it's like they built an imposing altar. Right? And then the western tribes, they come with the high priest and they say, don't do that. Don't do this. Right? And just to give some context, right? So they built, they built a replica of the actual altar designated where the tabernacle is going to be. That's where you offer sacrifices and burnt offerings to the Lord according to their style of worship. And that's the only place you do it. And so the western tribes thinking, they're building another altar. They're thinking they're going to do their own sacrifices. They're going to do their own religion. No, they can't do that. And again, they were calling to remembrance other times when there was rebellion among the Israelites, and it affected all of them. But then what do we see, right? The eastern tribes, they say, and I love how when we pick it up right there, right, in verse 18, if I remember correctly, right? No, 22. The mighty one, God the Lord, the mighty one, God the Lord, he knows, right? So they're saying, no, guys, wait, you got it all wrong. Got it all wrong. We just did this because we want us to remember and our descendants to remember, right? And why? Because remember now, there's the Jordan River. And, that's a natural boundary line. And sometimes people might think, well, the Jordan separates us, so yeah, they're not part of us. That's what they were thinking, that might creep in later on. They say, so we're going to build an altar, a replica that reminds our descendants that, no, we belong to the Lord, just like the western tribes. And far be it from us. I love that, right? No. We're not going to offer sacrifice. No. Far be it from us, right? That we would rebel against the Lord. That was not our intent, right? On the contrary, that's not what we're about. And then, of course, we're not going to read it. You can read the rest of the chapter 2. But Phinehas and the rest of the representatives from the western tribes, they're like, oh, okay, all right. We see it now, and yes, God's blessing be upon us all. Today we know that the Lord is with us because you're not being unfaithful. Now we know what your intentions are, your motivations are, and happy ending. They all lived happily ever after. What I see here, brothers and sisters, in this story is some really good nuggets for you and for me whenever we're dealing in conflict with others, with family members, with our children even, with our spouses, and especially in church. And like I said, the title is, right, Church is Worth Fighting For. And why is that? Well, obviously because just like the Apostle Paul tells the Ephesian elders in Acts, even as he's leaving them, with tears in his eyes, he says, guys, love one another, take care to protect the flock that has been entrusted to you. Why? Because Jesus spilled his own blood for this flock. And that's why church is worth fighting for, because Jesus died for it. Jesus died for the church. It's you and me. And can I just say this too? Conflict, yes, it's a part of life. And here's the other thing too, right? We've been talking about a life of faith. Brothers and sisters, you cannot grow spiritually unless you're in a church. You cannot grow spiritually. You cannot grow spiritually alone. You have to be in a community of people who are following Jesus. You have to be in a community of people who are different than you. And that's where conflict really arises, right? Man, if everyone just thought the way I did, man, it would be great church. It's so important, brothers and sisters. Church is worth fighting for. So point number one, if I would say this, is are you in a church? Are you committed to the local body of Christ? Whenever someone comes and checks us out, and I hate to use the word, but it's useful, right? Sometimes they're church shopping. And I tell them, hey, I'm glad that you're here, praise God, but hey, I don't want you here unless God has called you here. And I challenge them. I say, pray if God wants you here. And I've had these conversations with people and saying, you know what? You need to go where you feel the Lord is calling you. And I'm absolutely convinced if this is a priority, if Jesus died for this, then he will let you know where you're called to go. And then not only that, but then yes, commitment, right? There's a commitment to the community. And let me just read a quote from Jean Vanier, right? Some of you know that he built the communities all around the world for people with disabilities. Really amazing individual. And listen to this quote that, again, comes out of this book. Everybody's normal till you get to know them. So true. Everyone. Communities need tensions if they are to grow and deepen. Tensions come from conflicts. A tension or difficulty can signal the approach of a new grace of God. Did you hear that? A tension or difficulty can signal the approach of a new grace of God, but it has to be looked at wisely and humanly. And so, again, church, so important, right? And even one of our values here in the church, right? Yes, absolutely. You can only grow deep in the Spirit in community with others, right? We did that sermon series a while back, the one another's. Depending on how you count, there's over 40 one another's in the New Testament that highlight our commitment that we must have to one another. Love one another, encourage one another, pray for one another, carry one another's burdens, admonish one another, pray for one another. All of these things, brothers and sisters, it's important. But in doing so, right, conflict will arise. It will happen. And just like we see right here, I don't know about you, but as I'm reading this and I'm thinking, like, why didn't the Eastern tribes say, hey, you know what, guys? We're thinking about building this imposing altar. Don't get worried. These are our intentions, right? No, and who knows? Maybe they were like, they just thought about it along the way. Hey, let's build an imposing altar. Who knows? Maybe, right? Or same thing, right? When we first read that, in like the Western tribes were like ready to go to war, like right away. It's like, maybe, why didn't you, instead of get ready, do the battle cry first, why didn't you maybe like just send a couple people first before you did all that and ask, hey, what are you guys doing, right? Instead of getting it to that point. And again, I think that are great highlights for you and for me. Sometimes that happens, right? Sometimes I'll do something and I'll forget to tell Grace what I'm doing or it happens in relationships. right? Sometimes we forget to say things, or sometimes we think we've said things, and we never really said them. Oh, I only said that in my head. Oh, yeah, that's right. I was asking my daughter, I was like, can you give me an example of times when there's been misunderstandings? And she says, yep, like on Snapchat. When she sends a snap to a friend, and she can tell that they haven't opened it or whatever, and she's like, why haven't they opened it? And then she realizes, oh, I forgot to send it. Right? Sometimes we get all in a bunch, and we're like, and then, sometimes misunderstandings happen. That's just part of life. But I want us to point out a couple of things, and again, there are good nuggets for you and for me whenever we're dealing with conflict. Because like I said, it's not the question of whether or not there is conflict in a relationship, in a church, in a community. There will be. It's how we handle it. And so what I'd like to suggest is this, and as we look at the conversation, the discussions between the two tribes, what do we see first and foremost? They put the Lord first. It's all about God's holiness and God's righteousness, right? And yeah, maybe we could say the Western tribes were a little bit self-righteous here, but they had good reason, right? Because they even mentioned back in the past too, right? I mean, there were other times in the history when they were wandering in the wilderness, and some of the people sinned, and then that affected the whole camp. And they're like, don't do this. And they even brought up Achan. Remember Achan that we read about in Joshua? When he took some of the spoils from Jericho when he wasn't supposed to and hid them in his tent. And what ended up happening? The whole Israelites lost the next battle. Why? Because Achan disobeyed the Lord. And so it's all about God's holiness and God's righteousness that they're bringing this up. And I would say that that's key. And of course, sometimes, we get into disagreements with one another, and that's not as obvious. Or sometimes we think, our righteousness is the Lord's righteousness. We mistake that sometimes. But what I see there, brothers and sisters, is, let's keep the Lord first. Am I coming from a heart of pure motive? Am I coming from a heart that has the mind of Christ? Am I coming at it recognizing, okay, God is on the throne. God is who is the one that I am to please, so God first, brothers and sisters, and even in response, the Eastern tribes likewise. What did they say right off? Can I just beautiful, right? The Eastern tribes. Let's just think about this with me for a moment, right? If someone came to you and started talking like the Western tribes did, don't do this. Don't defile yourselves in the Lord. Come on. And it was they were totally misunderstanding you. What do you think your first reaction would be? How dare you? So they come at it with let's say, self-righteousness, and then the temptation for us is to come right back with self-righteous anger as well and get defensive. Come on, let's be honest here. We've been there. But what did they do? Same thing, right? Again, verse 22, I love it. They repeat it twice. If it's repeated twice in the Bible, it's very important. The mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows. And let Israel know, if this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. Same thing. They put the Lord first. And, let me tell you, right there, boom. You get that out of the way first. You get that settled first. Man, the rest is smooth sailing. If God is first in any relationship, in any conflict, if God is first, if the goal is to honor the Lord, the goal is to please the Lord first. The goal is maybe even just to say to defend the Lord's honor first. Absolutely. Number one. But then number two is, I will say this, is go directly to that person. Right? Again, Western tribes, so they did the battle cry and they sent Phineas, but they went directly to the Eastern tribes and said, hey, let's talk. Let's parlay. Come on. Right? The western tribes didn't go, to the other, to the other Canaanites that they had already conquered. And do you see what our eastern tribes are doing? Do you see? How could they? No, they didn't do that. They went directly. And can I just, I know it's tough. It really is. Because sometimes we're like, you know what? I'm just sharing this with that other person because I need them to hear where I'm coming from. And maybe they're going to give me good counsel. Okay, I can see that. And there are definitely people that we should get counsel from, that we do trust, that we do listen to, that we do, I've said this before, we need to have friends that we can share secrets with. But we also need to be very careful that we're not gossiping. Very careful. And I think a very good key is, are you sharing with the mind of reconciling? And again, what did I say? First, God first. Are you sharing in mind that you want God to be first in this conflict? God to be first in this relationship? God to be first in your heart? God to be first in their heart, the person that you're having conflict with, for example? If not, then and again, like I said, it's a fine line. But you got to be careful, right? And even the Apostle Paul in Galatians 6, when he's telling the church in Galatians, right? He says, right? He's like, if your brother is caught in a sin, what? Restore him gently. But then what does he say? He says, but be careful. But watch yourselves, or you also may be tempted. And that goes for the person you're sharing with, for example, who's not maybe that third party. Be careful. Please be careful. So God first, go directly, right? And then secondly, right? Or I guess thirdly, if I'm saying God first is point number one, go directly, point number two. Point number three is this, brothers and sisters. Go in love and humility. Go in love and humility. And what do we see here? You know what? Okay, so again, this is all a misunderstanding, first of all. And then the Western tribes, they come, right? And I love the way, even though if we were to read this, they could say, all right, they jump to conclusions, right? They jump to conclusions. I mean, obviously we read it was an imposing altar, so okay. They jump to conclusions. But what did they do? Why did they come? They came in love and humility. And I can see that, brothers and sisters, when even in the very time that they're sort of saying, why are you doing this? Don't do this. They even are willing to sacrifice their own land that had been given to them and say, look, don't do this. If you guys are tempted to do this, come over to the western side. We'll give you some of our land. Just don't do this. They're willing to sacrifice in the name of reconciling, right? It was right there in verse 19. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us, but do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, right? So they're saying, don't do this, please. And again, they're pleading. And they're willing to even sacrifice. Go in love and humility when the conflict arises. You know, the interesting thing, right, is why did they build this altar in the first place? They built it out of fear. Did you catch that? Because when we read their response, the Eastern tribes' response in verse 24, they said, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, hey, you guys aren't really part of us, because we got the Jordan River right here. And if I may say this, the Jordan River kind of serves as like, right, like I said, it's like a natural boundary line for many. And so, yeah, I could see that. They say, oh, well, you guys are on the other side of the river, right? I mean, in the Jordan, back then, you know, like what we read about, remember when they crossed the Jordan miraculously too, just like an echo of crossing the Red Sea, right? It must have been pretty big. But natural boundary line, okay, fine. But they built it out of fear. They built that imposing altar out of fear. And sometimes that's where conflict comes from. And that's what sustains conflict, is fear. But we believe, right? God's perfect love does what? Casts out all fear. There is no fear when God's perfect love is around. And so when you go to that person with God first in mind, go directly. You go in the love of Christ, in the humility of Christ, like it says in Philippians 2, right? Considering them better than yourself. And maybe you are in the right. And Paul even said in Philippians 2, right? Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not use it to his own advantage, but instead gave it all up and surrendered himself even to death on a cross. Go in love and humility, brothers and sisters. And then as I wrap up here, just a couple of things that I want to say. So the Jordan River, like I said, it's like one of those natural boundary lines. And if you'll give me some metaphorical license here, right, what do we see? We see the eastern tribes and the western tribes, and there was the Jordan River in between. That Jordan River can sometimes be a natural point of difference between people. You follow me so far? If I were to use that Jordan River as an example of a difference, right, where we say, well, you're on that side, I'm on that side. Boy, I could think of a lot of things where we differ. And sometimes, right, it's usually in things where, again, we jump to conclusions because we see them on the other side. And we don't bother to remember God first, go directly, go in love and humility, and we make judgments. How could they support Trump? They're not a Christian. How could they support the Democratic Party? They're not a Christian. How could they be against homosexuality? They're not a Christian. So many differences of opinion. And some are very important. But again, brothers and sisters, I want to challenge you and me today. Church is worth fighting for. And before we jump to conclusions, my challenge to you and to me is, especially if we're experiencing conflict with someone, don't just jump to that conclusion, write them off. But instead, I challenge you and me today. Let's go directly. Let's go in love and humility with God first, that we want to honor God. You know, and here's the thing. A lot of times, a lot of this righteous anger that you and I feel sometimes is because we believe that we are defending God's holiness or God's love. You hear me? Sometimes we feel that. We're feeling like we're defending God's holiness or we're defending God's love. And I am here today to tell you, brothers and sisters, you cannot do one without the other. If you are trying to defend God's holiness without God's love, then you're not defending God's holiness anymore. You're defending your own. If you're trying to defend God's love without remembering that our God is holy, then you're not defending God's love either anymore. God's love and God's holiness are intertwined. They are inseparable. That is what makes him unique. If I could say that real quickly, God's love and God's holiness, brothers and sisters, are together. And if you do not have love for the one you disagree with, then you are no longer about God's holiness. And if you do not have God's holiness in mind, as you are talking about God's love, then you are not talking about God's love anymore. And let's boil it down real quick. Pastor Marty, Fellowship Alliance Chapel, where Grace and I were before, I love the way he said this. And again, it speaks so good to conflict and confrontation. And before you can bring in the load of correction, you have to lay the tracks of love. Right? And relationally, right? Before you can say, thus saith the Lord, have you laid the tracks of love first? And we see Jesus telling us this, right, in Matthew 5 and Matthew 18 on how to handle, right, conflict. And Jesus himself even said it. And I don't want us to miss this point, brothers and sisters. Right? That's when he says, you've heard it said that, that if you commit murder, that's wrong. But he says, I tell you this, even if you tell your brother or sister, you're stupid, you're guilty of committing murder. You're guilty if you have hatred in your heart towards somebody else, you're guilty of murder just the same. And then he says, and so this is so important, so crucial, that if you are at the altar and you're about to offer your gift to the Lord, he said, that's not as important as going to be reconciled with that brother or sister. Jesus, in effect, said it's more important to reconcile with that person than to worship him. That's how important this is. Don't let sin fester, brothers and sisters.